Hello everybody, it's great to see some new faces. So just in case you aren't aware, the format is Nuno and I have a fairly relaxed chat about his journey and the journey he's on at the moment. And then we will either take questions at the end or we'll intersperse it with questions depending on how it's going. But if you do have a burning question, please put your hand up and I'll come to you as soon as I can, if that's okay. So it's Nuno, thank you very much for coming tonight.
No, thanks for inviting me and having me.
One of Bournemouth's stalwarts of the startup scene, I think. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. But could you perhaps start by just introduce yourself and telling people a little bit about Nourish?
Okay, so my name is Nuno. I'm Portuguese. I grew up in Portugal. First about 18 years of my life I spent them in Portugal. I was always a bit of an entrepreneur. I started very early. I think part of that, there's lots of hindsight, looking back, working out why on earth did I become an entrepreneur. So I'm gonna delve a bit into that because that creates context. So I come from a very mixed family. My mum is essentially, she descends from a Jewish family, and my dad comes from a Northern African Muslim family, and both families have lived in Portugal now for about 2 centuries. Now, Portugal is a country that is 96% Catholic, which has a really terrible habit of expelling people if they are not just like everybody else. So they gained this habit of not talking about religion too much. I was the only child in a 1,000 pupil strong school who didn't go to Sunday school. And that kind of makes you or breaks you because, yes, I mean, nowadays we have a word for it, it's called bullying. But back then, you were just different, and that was just enough for people to pick on you. In my case, it made me in more than one way because the reason why I created Nourish is deeply connected to that. So I've always felt amazingly comfortable with being different. I never felt that I needed to abide by rules or try to comply. And that brings you into all sorts of trouble. But it makes you feel incredibly free when you have an idea and you want to run with it. Mostly if you have loving parents, that tends to help a lot. I ended up going through studies, did electronics, and ended up specializing in robotics, statistics, artificial intelligence. And I was very lucky that I found a couple of co-founders still at the university, and we started a company back then that was relatively successful. I mean, I want to say relatively successful because it wasn't a unicorn or anything like that. But we grew that company being fairly clueless about how to grow a company. We grew that company from a science paper that was published and caught the attention of the right people into a £35 million revenue company. And then I exited that in 2008. 2010, I was bored to death because I'm sure you hear this story time and time again. When people exit a company and they make a bit of money, they very soon come to realize that money was the least of their problems. It's kind of, if you're an entrepreneur, you really need something to do desperately. So I think in 2010, I was really bored. And I was spending time in Poole and Bournemouth. I love Dorset, and there's a number of reasons why Dorset ended up the place where I set down roots and decided that this was going to be home. And I wanted to create a business that allowed me to tick a couple of boxes. So one of my first boxes was I wanted to create a business that had a very direct impact on quality of life for people that live with some degree of frailty. Now, this was important to me. If I came from a religious background, that would be a lot easier to explain. Given that I don't, the way I usually explain it is that, growing up in that sort of environment, you very quickly develop an instinct to show everybody else that you can do a lot of good for others without having a religion. And that was a massive driver for me that I'd never noticed before. I'm still looking around and telling my neighbors and my distant relatives that, I don't really need to have a religion. I'm helping others the best way I can. And Nourish is a result of that, frankly. I mean, it is a combination between understanding the complexities of a business, understanding the complexities of a sector that is perhaps a little bit out of the beaten track. So for those who don't know, Nourish operates primarily, although not exclusively, within social care, which, hold on, it's not as unsexy as it sounds. We launched a first prototype in 2013, and in 2014 we did a lot of ground kind of truth testing, and in 2015 we launched, and the company now is ticking along. So
let's talk about the original idea for Nourish. And obviously you'd had the success previously, and then you get bored, and I know that's like everybody gets bored. Where did the idea come from? The actual idea to do something in that particular sector and that particular solution? Was it something you'd experienced? Was it just
no? I don't know. It was a very long process. So my search process, and you can probably tell, I think you will all be able to tell that I had time. So my search process was very simple. I wanted an impact business that I could grow, where if the business was to grow and scale up, I wouldn't be forced to move to London. Now, this is a pretty kind of, it's a very personal kind of criteria. When you have that sort of criteria, the first thing you do is you look at the local economy and you understand what is the structure of the local economy. Because if you're going to create a business that has no relationship with the local economy, then, you're doomed. The moment the business succeeds, you're in London. And when you look at the local economy, you have tourism and you have financial services, and the third largest contributor to the local economy is, surprise, surprise, social care. That caught my eye. That was I probably must have received, a report from one of the economic development people within Pool Council back in 2010. And I looked at those papers, it caught my eye. I started reading more about social care, and the more I read, the more enthusiastic I was about it. Because if you're an entrepreneur and you're thinking about how to put a business together, social care has so many components for success. So back in 2010, what we knew was public sector budget is going to be slashed by 30% over the next 5 years due to kind of the narrative of austerity. We have a demographic tide where there is no way there's going to be less demand for social care or for support for people who live with frailty, primarily in kind of older part of life. And at the same time, there was that part of me going, this is the absolute ideal sector for me to make an impact, right? Because it's obviously a sector that is unstable, that is unsustainable in many ways. There's going to be disruption. And frankly, there was a part of me that in 2010-11, I had no idea what the product was going to be. So I did the typical, very entrepreneurial thing of, it's one of my favorite definitions of entrepreneurship is you essentially, you put all your eggs in one basket and put that basket very tucked into a rucksack, and then you throw yourself off a cliff and you build an aircraft on the way down. And that is exactly what I did. So 2011, I became a volunteer in a care home. I didn't do just that, and I wasn't doing that just for the do-gooding aspect of becoming a carer. I mean, it was amazing, it's great, I recommend it. But I was trying to get under the skin of how does a care team operate? What are the expectations of people receiving a service like this? What are the expectations of a manager within a service like that? But I was just on a learning curve. I essentially just became a very, very obsessive learner about anything to do with social care.
And is that just because you saw the the size of the opportunity in healthcare and what, and especially like in the social care area, had been not ignored, but it's not an obvious area to initially look at, is it? It's one of those things that everybody goes, oh, somebody else will do that in 5-10 years, and eventually it'll catch up to the rest of the world.
That is the other criteria. It's because it's seen as a deeply and sexy vertical. It's so less likely that you're gonna get Me Too's getting into the segment.
Well, especially when you were talking about is 2011.
Yeah.
I think that's probably less true now. I mean, we were talking before how we've had 2-3 healthcare startups, and now you can't sort of move for healthcare startups in certain areas. But 8-7 years ago, that certainly wouldn't have been the case.
No. And in 2011, it was certainly not a digital healthcare was not hyped up until 2014. And in 14, I think we experienced what can only be described as a pre-bubble, because all of a sudden, every VC on the land went from never having looked at healthcare to everyone wanted to have a healthcare fund, ignoring completely the complexities of creating anything in healthcare. I mean, we will go into that, but social care or healthcare, they're in many ways very similar. Thank you, Marcus. They are in many ways very similar, but what they have in common is that the complexity is just mind-blowing. A lot of people, because my previous business was in aerospace and defense, and I will not go too much into that, but yeah, we were doing a lot of software for things that are still flying around the planet. So we were working on satellites, we were working on flight control for all sorts of crazy flying machines. But social care is actually a lot more complex than anything that I've been involved before. Because, physical laws are amazingly simple and steady. Once you understand
consistent.
them. Yeah, they are very consistent. The more you get human factors in the equation, you constantly need to cater for more and more and more complexity. So operating in this sort of environment, you need to cater for a lot of complexity, a lot of kind of non-straightforward constructs in designing your service, designing your product.
And so I love the idea that you went to work in a care home as a carer to almost get under the skin of the market. And how long did you do that for, and at what stage did an idea start to form?
Yeah, I did that between 3 and 6 months. At the same time that I did that, I spent a lot of time at a think tank in London called the King's Fund, which is basically the healthcare think tank. I went to a lot of events, the Association of Directors of Social Care, that sort of stuff. Whenever there was an event that I could go to, I would probably just put my name down, pay the fee, attend, and just sit quiet in a corner, listening and absorbing as much as I could. And frankly, I spent 2 years doing nothing but learning. I was on purpose trying to avoid jumping on an idea. I started forming what I thought was the first iteration of an idea, probably late 2012. And my thinking was very simple. Essentially, I wanted to create a timeline for every person who lives with any degree of frailty, primarily around kind of cognitive function, memory, brain function. And the reason why I started zooming in on this cohort was mostly because people with regular visits, when they are receiving care at home, they very often are the ones who will do the communication between the care visitors that came in the morning and the nurse that came in at lunchtime and the carer that comes in at the afternoon, and by the way, my family that will call me to see how I'm doing at dinner time. If your memory goes, the system is just not ready to cope with that. So we'll get a carer missing a visit in the morning, the nurse goes in, the person is still in bed, and probably then there's a sequence of 4 or 5 visits throughout the day, and you get to the end of the day and family calls and asks, "Mom, how are you doing?" And Mom will say, "No one's been." And therefore, I wanted to crack that. I wanted to create some sort of, it's almost a second memory, to capture anything to do with interactions of that person with everybody else, so that everybody else could have a little bit of context within the realms of ethics and data governance. If a carer is coming in at 2 o'clock, let the carer know that there was a nurse here and that was a carer earlier. And if the family is calling in at 8, actually the family can have access to a timeline and know who were the visitors throughout the day.
And did that nugget come because you saw that just that wasn't happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I saw cases, and I'm saying I saw cases. This is not solved. This is still happening, but there are cases where a health visitor or a care worker will visit someone, say at 3 p.m. Today, and will make a note in the book saying that Mary is running out of milk. Please reorder milk. And the reason why they write, so there's a little notebook in the person's home, which is supposed to be used for this sort of linking between people. But that book doesn't, only has a physical existence there. So if Mary's running out of milk, that book is not seen by anyone who can buy milk, probably until 3 weeks down the line. And I saw this time and time again, and this still happens. Now I'm using milk so that we don't go into more gore kind of scenarios, but you can just imagine, right? So there's a lot of people receive continence care. Go figure.
Yeah, I've had personal experience of that, and it's not a great situation to be in. But so you had, I mean, I love the fact that you spent 2 years investigating your subject. So the startups that I speak to, the number of times I've had people come to me and say, and they talk about their idea, and I say, well, what experience do you have or knowledge in that area? And they say, well, I don't know, it's just an idea. And they've never done anything in that related area. And you do need to learn your subject, don't you? If you don't know that subject area, you're sort of lost before you've started, haven't you?
I've done social care uninterrupted learning now for 9 years, and I still feel like the dullest person in the room when I'm in the room with care managers, right? It's kind of, you're always constantly learning, and there's always an angle that you didn't quite understand, that you didn't quite cover. Partly because I'm a slow learner. The other part is, this is really complex, right? The reason why we keep hearing, usually bad news, but the reason why we keep hearing that the government shies away from having a proper kind of political debate around social care, it's not for lack of trying. This is a really, really complex environment to operate in.
So you worked in the care home for a while and did that studying period, and you started to form the nugget of something. What happened next? Yeah,
so I think there was never a light bulb moment. This was a process that took a few years of sussing this out. But once I started getting this idea for a timeline around the person that receives care, I think my instinct was, if I have a large enough volume of data, and that was hypothesis number one, which, by the way, I still hold as our hypothesis number one for the company. The hypothesis was, if I have a high enough resolution data stream about the care this person requires or receives, I may just be able to design algorithms that will, through nudges to the care team, improve the quality of life for that person, right? I mean, sorry, it doesn't roll off the tongue, but you kind of understand the principle. Having that hypothesis, and this was 2013, I was narrowing down on this. 2013 was the time when Fitbits and wearables and so on started coming up with the first wave of adoption with products that looked like they had a degree of robustness. And I have that to blame for my first distraction, because at the time when I saw those products surging, my engineer's brain, which is really horrible because you need to constantly control it and rein it in. My engineer's brain told me that you could potentially use some of these wearables to generate that data stream. And that was my first pivot, because I did that for like 9 months. And then you start realizing that this hardware is never going to work. Plus, you then start realizing that all the user experience that these wearable devices are being designed The cohorts they're being designed for are the 16 to 35-year-old. And therefore, if it requires you to do the pairing, the Bluetooth pairing between a device and the smartphone, you're lost. So, drawing board, and at that point, I think that's where having experience does count. Because when I went back to the drawing board, what came to mind is the amount of information that carers have to record on the job. Now, social care, a little bit of context. Social care is regulated by at least 3 different entities, regardless of where it happens. And then, as a massive contrast, you do have some social care being delivered without any regulation. But if you operate within a regulated environment, i.e. if you are one of the 27,000 registered care providers in the UK, you will have to be inspected by the Care Quality Commission. And there is a regimen for how that happens, but the Care Quality Commission is essentially an independent body that will inspect the care home, and if they don't like what they see, they will shut the care home down. So they are feared by most care managers, and therefore what happens is care managers will encourage their team to record absolutely everything they do. So the job of a carer consists of looking after people for 7.5 hours if it's an 8-hour shift, and then they get to the end and they have to write down every single interaction they had with that person, just in case CQC comes along and wants to have proof that you've done the oral hygiene, you've done the transfer between bed and wheelchair, and the person had enough to eat, and they have to write all of that down. Now, in hindsight, I was being very, very dumb by not spotting that as the first opportunity, but there is also an element of timing. So, carers in general were seen as completely unable to adopt technology. And in 2013, what I was seeing in care homes was carers, not the vast majority of them, but a small proportion of carers, walking into the care home with their smartphone and switching it off, putting it in their pocket, and then spend a off-the-grid, completely paper-based day, and then they would leave their shift, they would pick their phone, and they would be on Facebook. That's really curious. Because then what I thought was the opportunity here is for us to make the life of the carer a lot easier by allowing them to record the care as the care happens, and I'm creating my data stream. So the business idea, and that's what the business is nowadays, is basically a business to make the life of the carer a lot easier in everything that comes down to demonstrating regulatory compliance. Now, saying that sounds really straightforward, because then just go out and understand the regulatory requirements, create a few checklists, put them on a screen, you're flying, right? You're talking about a sector where a mobile device that costs anything above £200 is just out of reach in terms of budget. And in 2013, there were no smartphones for less than £250. So there was a massive stunt here in terms of timing, time to market, the changing mindsets and openness of minds from care teams to actually adopting technology, and also the cost of technology.
So present with that challenge and the idea. Did you have an MVP? Did you have any form of product? Was it still an idea? And how did you? I suppose a couple of questions. How long did it take you to build that initial project? And then, given those limitations and the challenges with the smartphone, how did you get your first paying customer?
So let me just describe the journey of the MVP. Right. So beginning of 2013, the hypothesis was we can probably have a carer doing a full shift, recording everything that they need to record using a handheld device. We still call them handheld devices. We don't like calling them phones because they don't use them as phones. Handheld device, and they get to the end of the shift, and we just ask them a really simple question, which I'm sure everyone here who has ever done user research and user experience will be familiar with that principle. Just ask one question, binary answer. Would you go back to paper, yes or no? And we probably did around, I want to say about 30 iterations of that app within 18 months. Spent best part of £1 million. And that was probably the stage over which we did our most important work. Because that's the stage at which you are designing everything to do with the human factors of creating an app to go into an environment that is traditionally, we're talking about an environment that is averse to technology. I have a very clear justification of why the environment is averse to technology, but the environment is averse to technology, so you need to work with that.
So I have to interrupt there because I think one of the things that flew out is we spent £1 million bit. Was that sort of £1 million out of your own pocket? Had you funded it? Where did that £1 million come from?
It was out of my own pocket.
Okay, so invested.
Yeah.
Okay. And that yes/no question, presumably by the end of the 18 months, you were getting, hopefully, presumably lots and lots of, no, I wouldn't go back to.
It was, as soon as it hit 80%, I knew we were onto something.
And was that always your measure from the start? Was it, right, I need to get this to 80%, or was it?
No, we wanted to get it as high as possible.
Yeah.
But I always had the feeling that if we were plateau around 50, we'd have a serious challenge when it comes to adoption. I think if it was 65% or over, I would still go to market with it. Now, the one thing I need to highlight, and you'll probably think that this is all a little bit crazy, but I read The Lean Startup. I read that book 2 or 3 times. And I just couldn't believe how alien that entire book was to me. Because the concept of identifying your 2 or 3 key stakeholders for a product, identifying whoever is going to pay for it, and then design obsessively for that role so that you can start generating revenue really quickly. That in itself is the reason why technology is not welcome within health and social care. Because your users of the technology are never going to be the people paying for it. So it's the nurses, it's the doctors, and actually who pays for it, it's usually the CCG or the owner of a care group. So when I looked at this sector and the technology that existed in this sector, all I could see was products that were frankly just not very good, conversations between closed doors that went along the lines of, oh yeah, but your carers don't use the technology because they're a bit stupid. And because I was a carer, I felt that was personal. Because I worked with a lot of carers that are anything but stupid. And frankly, the ratio of stupidity in a care team is probably lower than in most environments. And it's shocking that was going on.
But I mean, it's interesting to talk about lean startup. So one of the things I think about lean startup is, I think it works very, very well for very simple problems. If it's a complex problem, and the one that you've just alluded to, and the one that you're working on, you cannot go and build a solution in 2 months and talk to 2 people and then get customers and then get another 10 off. It just takes time, and it takes money, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, in our case, so I was very aware of things like the Caldecott principles for data sharing. I mean, it's the sort of stuff that unless you're in healthcare, you would probably never come across that. But designing a system where you need to be very aware that you're dealing with the most private information about each person that is being cared for. So we're not designing a system where you can just import a framework from Facebook and start coding. There's a lot of nuance around who gains access to the data, when and why, and then being able to actually create a full logging framework to make sure that everyone who accesses that data, we know that they access that data. And in 7 years' time, we can go back and still know that that carer accessed that record on that day. That is just so alien from the concept of go and develop an MVP and then test it. So in our case, yes, we spent a ridiculous amount of money and time making sure that it worked for carers before we started working out, okay, how is this going to make money? And that was probably mid to late 2014.
Okay.
So yeah.
And you hit the 80%. You start to think, well, actually, I can go to market with this. I'm very close. And is that when you start to think, well, okay, how do we make money with it?
Yeah, it absolutely was. I mean, to be honest, my wife is completely to blame because when she was keeping track of numbers, she started telling me, hang on, that's a great idea. But, and you need to define what is your how far is the limit, right? So, and in our case, for me, it was mostly about, I want to demonstrate that the product works before I even try to work out how to make money, because from experience and from looking at what others have done, the how to make money is a distraction that you don't need when you're dealing with a context that is already complex enough. Our thought process was really simple. We wanted to start working with the smallest possible care providers so that we could demonstrate it, create case studies, and then start scaling up. Selling to smaller care providers is in principle a lot easier. And that's exactly what we did. So we only sold to single care homes for the first 18 months. We started selling in 2015. We did our first exhibition in beginning of 2015, and we sold on the spot. So clearly there was already a segment of care providers that when they saw what we were building, they immediately bought into the vision. And I think people bought more into the vision than they bought into the product or the maturity of the product, although the product was already usable and it was robust, and they started using it. Our first client was deployed in February 2015.
Okay. And you were still funding it yourself then, or did you?
So by then, we'll talk about the funding journey, I'm sure. But by then, I was, and I still am, very much in that learning curve. I'm still very conscious of how much I don't know within social care. I'm still very conscious of how much I don't know, full stop, because there is, I was never tremendously experienced at marketing, for instance. Operations is really not my cup of tea. I can do it for a little while, but it's like a dog walking on its back legs. They can do it, but it's just not elegant, right? And I really can't. I really can't run a team. I can do the.
You're not bigging yourself up, are you? It's
No. I mean, I kind of. It's being conscious of that makes sure that you will not screw up royally when you actually start pumping money into the business. And because I was always very aware of that from previous experience, you need a couple of things. You need to, when you're recruiting, you really need to be very aware of your biases and of your weaknesses, because you need to, you recruit for patching your weaknesses in the first 10 recruits of of building your team, essentially. Which in my case, I mean, I'm still going. So but then you also recruit your investors. And in my case, yes, it was true that I was very, very lucky to I had a 200% subscription for my first round of investment, which meant that I could go through the list of angel investors that wanted to put money in the business and just go, yes, no, yes.
And so let's talk about that for a short while in terms of that angel funding. At what point did you go for that? What year are we
so
talking
it
about?
was mid 2014.
Okay.
And essentially what we had was a demonstration that we had a prototype that a few care teams were using and were raving about.
Okay. Were those care homes paying for it at that point?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you had some paying customers.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, paying, but it was not enough to pay even a single wage,
Yeah,
right?
but they're paying
yeah.
something. Yeah. Okay. And what sort of raise did you go for in terms of the angel raise?
We wanted to raise 200,000.
Okay.
On a the first raise is always a massive piece of string exercise of what is the value of the business. It's kind of, I got a slide deck and I have a product that costs quite a lot of money and I have a couple of care homes using it. And then it is about telling the story and it is about, I go back to the vision, right? So people are buying into your vision. And if you are articulate about how you describe your vision, your investors will be part of your team.
And was that money raised locally?
Yes.
So I know where we're going with this.
Yeah.
Should we just sit here and laugh for a second? So could you talk a little bit about that journey? Because you've also been involved with Dorset Business Angels, haven't you?
I did say that I was quite bored. So in 2011-12, I was spending a lot of time in Dorset and essentially working out. I mean, I love this place, but there is something about this place that sits very uncomfortably. And when I tried to put my finger on it, it was clearly the lack of entrepreneurship or the lack of a startup culture, which I found quite surprising considering that we have massive universities locally and a lot of youth combined with a lot of money. And when in 2012, what was happening was we were in kind of full-blown financial crisis, and the government created this amazing scheme called the SEIS scheme, which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with. But it stands for, I don't even know, Enterprise Investment Scheme.
Yeah.
And essentially, and then there is the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme. But essentially what it means is that if you have a really, really large tax bill, which is often the case if you are a business owner, you extract lots of dividends, or if you have a lot of savings accumulated and you're paying a lot of tax on your interest, you can choose to, instead of sending the tax to the revenue, you send your tax money into a startup. Now, the likelihood of getting that cash back is very low, as we all know, but if the startup goes anywhere, you can exit. Once you sell your shares in that business, you pay zero tax. So it is a very appealing scheme. And curiously enough, it was something that was not in the radar of most high net worth individuals in the BH13 postcode. So, and that's the bit that I'm sure Andrew was steering towards. I raised, to this day, all bar one, all our investment, all our angels live within BH13, which also comes with a price, which is they all know where I live.
Oh dear.
But I mean, that's kind of, when you're putting any company together, it doesn't matter if it's a unicorn or if it's a corner shop or a flower shop. There's a lot of the exercise of putting the business together is essentially committing yourself to honoring promises to others.
So if you don't mind, you've obviously very well invested yourself in terms of the money you put in terms of building the product. And I think to some people, the fact that you then raised another £200,000 sort of thinks, well, what's the point of that? You know, why not just carry on yourself? What drove you getting that investment?
So let me explain who I have as my investors. I'm not going to mention names, but my lead investor is a chap that did a management buyout for £200 million of a technology business, transformed that technology business within 5 years and sold it for $1 billion. My other angel has been through a sequence of about 5 groups of creating groups of care homes and then selling those groups of care homes and going on to the next one and then creating another one and going on to the next one. She did that 5 times, and she's a registered nurse. I wouldn't have a clue of where to start to gain the experience and the knowledge and the points of view that they bring to the table. I have the owner of 2 or 3 marketing agencies that operated up and down the country. He understands marketing inside out. I mean, I would need 2 lifespans to get the experience in marketing that he brings to the table. So that's why you really cannot. It's incredibly dangerous. I would become poor. That's simple, because you don't know where to stop. You just carry on spending your money until you don't have any more money, and then you go to investors, desperate. At which point you don't have a choice of investors.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to your earlier point, which is you recognise your weaknesses, and so to me it sounds like a part of your investment with finding those angels was about you filling those gaps that you didn't have.
Absolutely was. Yeah, absolutely was. And to this day, the greatest asset they bring to the table is being available at the end of the phone. So if I have an issue, which never happens, but if I have an issue, I can pick the phone up, call them. If they're within the same time zone, which sometimes doesn't happen, they will give you a call back within 2 hours. And it doesn't really matter what it is. It may be you're signing a multi-million-pound contract with a client and there's a clause you don't like, and you have 2 options. You call the lawyer will charge you 500 quid for the call and will be completely clueless of the context of that clause. Or you call your chairman and your chairman go, yeah, I've seen those before, this is what we do. And you just go, yeah, thanks for checking. That is priceless, right? It's just, and you're in the same boat. Now you are sharing your journey with people that have a wealth of experience completely diverse from yours, who are very aligned in their interests. And that is priceless. Yeah.
So you raised the angel money, and in 2015 you started to get some paying customers. And so what happened next? Did you carry on selling to the small care homes?
Yes. So by the end of 2015 we had 17 care homes paying for our product. So we went from 3 at the end of March that year to 17 at the end of December. That was essentially a learning journey, because you deploy the product. So the things we developed by then, and I cannot emphasize enough, in this sector you have the product, but the product isn't but 20% of the service you provide, because you need to provide the product after you trained people up, after you supported people for a period of time so that they gain confidence that they can do what they need to do with the product. And then we give every single carer, we currently have 25,000 carers using our product at any point in time during the day. Every single carer has direct access to our customer support through a chat window where our response time is about 2 minutes. Right?
Wow. So that's
24/7, 365 days.
So that's 25,000 carers using it today?
Yeah.
Okay. So
your question. So at the end of 2015, we had isolated care homes. We had to increase the complexity of the product tremendously over those first 12 months of go-to-market, because as I'm sure you all heard the story, there's always more features that clients want. There's always something else that is missing, and there's always something that your sales team is telling you that unless we have this, we're never gonna sell. So we always had a fairly mature approach to product management, so we didn't just start developing features because a customer wanted them, but we knew that we had a timeline for care teams, but we didn't have a care planning structure, which essentially shapes what the level of support and areas of support each person requires. So we had to develop all of that in the background in an environment that was, the more we learned about the environment, the more we realized that there is no one size fits all for what a care plan looks like. And I wanted to very quickly convert my first group, because I knew that selling to isolated care homes was not going to be a sustainable business model for very long.
And so, just before I come to main question, how many care homes are you working with now? You got 25?
So we ended 2015 with 17.
Yeah.
We currently have just under 800.
800, okay, great stuff. So for anybody, there's a great business plan there. In terms of, one of the things with startups that you talked to a lot, I talked to fewer, but some, always come up with rather unrealistic business plans about how you scale and how quickly you get to customers. So typically after 6 months, everybody thinks they have 10,000 customers. Nuno's scaling is probably a little bit more realistic in terms of that growth over 4 years to get to 800 is, that's the level that sounds, it's aggressive and it's very impressive, but it's far more realistic for anybody who's thinking about writing a business plan for a software company. So you're obviously not doing that with just yourself. So 4 years, in 2015 you had 7 care homes and you've now got 800. So that's quite a tremendous growth in the number of people as well.
Yeah.
So could we perhaps talk a little bit about that in terms of how many people are you at now?
So on the payroll is about 26, but then we operate with all sorts of freelancers and consultants and so on. So on a busy day in the office, there's about 34, 35 of us.
And we were talking before about why that's quite an important split between the full-time employees and the contracting staff. Why do you think that's important for any startups?
To be honest, that's a lesson I learned in the worst possible way. When you start scaling up the business, and this happened with Nourish as it happened with businesses I had before. When you start scaling up the businesses, you start developing a model that represents your perception of how this is going to grow. So in the beginning of 2016, 16, 17, we had a very clear model because we had been selling mostly into small care groups and small care operators. And the sales process is relatively well known. So we would have a first encounter, we would give a demonstration of the product, then have a couple of follow-ups, and then we would book a training day. People would go in, get trained, and get the team running with the software. Which meant that we had one very, very specific bottleneck. We had to train people. So we couldn't switch on that revenue until one of our trainers or a couple of our trainers paid a visit to that care provider on a specific day where all their carers were scheduled to come in slots of 1 hour and receive training from us. We got to a point where we had probably around 200,000 pounds of recurring revenue that were stuck waiting for training to happen. And we did what most startups would do in that case: throw money at training. Create an amazing, stellar training team with lots of numbers, lots of people in it. And that was exactly at the same point that we were trying to sell into larger and larger care providers. And the sales figures were showing very clearly that we were succeeding to move from the small size to mid-cap.
But presumably it's taking longer, was it?
It was taking longer, but not just that. We're talking about if you're selling to a group of 30 care homes with probably looking after 1,000 people, they have their own internal training teams. So we found ourselves 6 months down the line after creating a massive training team, we found ourselves not having training requirement and seeing record growth. So we could see that the monthly recurring revenue was growing significantly because we were selling to larger and larger clients, but we didn't have to train them because all we had to do was a kind of train-the-train cascade training. We trained their training team, they would go and train all their carers, at which point we had to cut numbers. And no entrepreneur, regardless of how cold-blooded we can pretend we are, enjoys the prospect of having to walk in the office one Monday morning and have that conversation with people. And I had to have that conversation with people because it's a matter of sanity. The business needs to take precedence. But once that happens, you just become hyper aware of, is this role something that I will have to fill in with a lifespan of 10 years? Or is this a role that is going to take 18 months and then I'm not quite sure? So I became super conservative when it comes to that decision. Which means that, yes, we are operating with about 34 or 35 people, but if we hit rough weather, we will not affect our permanent employees. And that is really, really important for me. So that is the rationale. Plus, yes, you do have roles that are perhaps better suited to people to come in with their amazing expertise, charging an absurd amount of money per day, but they deliver their goods. You're happy, they're happy, and you don't really need to worry about managing them as people. So, as pros and cons, I think everyone in the team is very positive about why we did that and why it's such a good idea.
And so, what are your plans for Nourish over the next couple of years? So, are you planning to raise more money? Do you think, no, that's it, I can grow with it? Can I bootstrap it? What's your thinking?
I have no idea.
Okay.
There's
investors knocking on your door frequently?
There's a spectrum of potential outcomes. So the business went through several rounds of investment. Actually, because of the proximity between shareholders, we don't really have a traditional relationship of the CEO having to report to the board once a year or once a quarter. We do quarterly meetings, but we are in touch most months. What that means is that there's quite a lot of, because there is so much proximity, there is a lot of trust. I never asked for massive raises of capital. So in 2017, we had an opportunity to raise £1 million, which was adequate. It was the right amount of money. I spoke to the investors, and we all agreed, look, there's a lot of hype about digital health in the city. Let me go up and spend a few months knocking at doors. We got offers. So we got VCs wanting to put money in our company, which a lot of people would see as a win. We ended up walking away from those offers and putting money ourselves. And the reasoning was very simply that you would lose that relationship of trust. For me, the cost in governance of having to justify why we spent those £50,000 on that, rather than just doing it because people trust each other, would be too high. That also meant that essentially we remain very lean at board level. So we have a board with 3 directors, despite having 10 angel investors, and they all trust the board. They all expect there to be a return. So there is no big secret in the fact that, yes, over the next 2-3 years, there will have to be a liquidity event. How we create this liquidity event, I think we're now at a scale. So just to give you an idea of scale, we are now, our annual recurring revenue is about £1.3 million. Now, that is the sort of scale that most private equity firms would be very, very keen to talk to us and our management team to essentially pay our angels to go on their way and give them a 3 or 4 time return. And I would stay with the business for another 10 years, growing it further. It's a potential outcome. It's something I potentially would like, because I don't, having gone through the process of selling a company and retiring, I don't really look forward to that. Plus, I still have a lot of aspiration for Nourish that isn't realized. So I still have, so Nourish over the last 12 months sold into about 30 hospitals in the UK. Now, we started with care homes. We're now operating in hospitals. We are increasingly looking at care in the community and care in extra care settings, which is essentially places where people go to retire and they just downsize into a small flat and there is care on site. And everything shows that there is a massive growth opportunity, not just in the UK, but globally, to cater for that segment. Now, I still feel like I have too much work to do to think of my window of opportunity to be another 2 years. I probably will overrun those 2 years tremendously. So I don't know. And to a very big extent, you actually don't control the outcome. So I have a hard rule, which is over the next 2 years, okay, they'll be tolerant if it's 3, but I need to create a liquidity event. That may be a private equity firm buying them out. It may be a trade sale. I am still at the phase of being really choosy, perhaps unrealistically so, about I want the perfect partner to come and buy us, and preferably a company that is a do-gooder company, so that I can feel at home and stay with them for another 5 years. We all know how that happens, right?
So it's an interesting question there, because I suppose the move into hospitals and outside of the 27,000 care homes, do you think that's come as a result of you thinking bigger picture? Because I know that if you were to go and try and raise serious money or to speak to a private equity firm on the basis that the total market is 27,000 care homes, they'd probably go, yeah, that might not probably be big enough for us. So you then start to think, well, actually, is that the reason that you start to think hospitals, or was it just a natural progression for the solution? How much is entrepreneurial and how much is just that's where the problem is?
Yeah, the vision is pretty big. The vision is big. The addressable market, it's really curious, because I speak about hospitals and all of a sudden people think, oh, that's a larger market.
But if you take that globally, though, if you go outside of that 27,000...
Yeah, so let me put things in context. There are more care workers in the UK than there are NHS workers in the UK. There are 128,000 beds in hospitals within the NHS. There are about 480,000 beds in care homes in the UK. So hospitals are tiny, but you are absolutely right in mentioning hospitals as global, because my thought, I feel quite claustrophobic operating a company that only operates in the UK. I'm just not like that. So the strategy to go global is via health. There is no doubt about that. Now, Nourish has evolved quite a lot. I don't want to bother you with the product description, but we nowadays are a very advanced kind of digital framework for care pathways, which means that any care pathway, it can be an orthopedic ward or it can be a cancer treatment ward, we can go in and we can codify what the care pathways are into Nourish, and people will use it within a ward to record observations, track information about that patient, and then interface to other systems. Which means that we are getting in the realms of true clinical impact of a digital system. We are getting in the realms of potentially global expansion, which is another reason why private equity may be a good partner for us to do that.
Excellent. So we're coming around to time, so I want to get some questions, but just before we finish, we talked about Bournemouth and startups, and I'm just really interested to hear your view of, what's your view of Bournemouth startups now and the scene and where it is compared to where it was a few years ago?
It's a heck of a lot more comfortable, because there are so many more startups now than there were in 2012. I mean, in 2012, you'd probably see one pitch every 6 months. I was involved, I think you know, I was involved as one of the founders of the Dorset Business Angels. One of the reasons why I got involved in that was because I wanted to do my bit to encourage more startups to happen down here. I then was, together with a bunch of other people, we created Silicon South, and I always held the view that you don't really see a lot of movement in the creation of a place if you only look at a 12-month window. Clearly, creation of a place is probably something that takes 40 years, and I think we can already see a significant difference between 2012 and 2019, and we haven't seen 10 years go by yet. Clearly, the Dorset Business Angels is now a thing. It runs itself, and there's pitch events every quarter. Yeah. And I don't know the exact numbers. They're very coy about the numbers, but there was, for as long as I was involved, there was quite significant investment going on. For me, it's a matter of there's three factors I always mention. It's The fact that we have a massive university with lots of younger talent down here. So that's factor number one. The most important kind of the raw material is present here. Then there is, for some weird reason, which I think I understand nowadays, but for some weird reason, there is a heck of a lot of marketing agencies down here. So with so many marketing agencies, what this means is that, yes, there is a lot of experienced talent that is down here. I wouldn't say it's completely available, but it's certainly a lot easier. And I'm saying this and it's almost like, it's painful to say it, but it's a lot easier to recruit a developer down here than if I was, say, I don't know, in Exmouth, right? Because there are lots of developers down here. They're probably not the right developers, they're probably not willing to move and so on, and it's just equally hard to recruit down here, but there is availability. So there is a mass of talent and creativity and experience. And in my mind, that was the thing that just didn't square, and it started squaring with the SEIS and people becoming more aware of kind of tax incentives for investing in startups. We have sandbanks, right? Dorset is a very pretty place that a lot of people come to on holidays, and when they retire with some money, they want to move here. And when they move here, they usually come with a lot of money and with big tax bills. And I think if we combine these things together, we have something pretty unique. I don't know. I never bothered to even try to calculate the number of available investment within BH13. BH13 is the Camphor Cliffs, Lilliput, Sandbanks postcode. It's into billions. It's clearly into billions, which means that, yes, if you have the right idea, if you develop the right partnerships, there is investment around. So I don't think there is shortage of available investment around here.
Excellent. Right. Does anybody have any questions at all?
Gosh, yeah, those are two really interesting questions. So, people not liking tech, I really just go back to people not designing products properly. Social care was seen as an afterthought. So people would design a product for healthcare, and then they would shoehorn something in social care. Or I heard the story a few times of my parents run a care home, and I took a software degree, and I developed the software for them, so therefore it will work for everybody else. And the software was designed for the parents, not for the carers that work there. So the lack of the lack of really good user experience and customer experience design, because it's not just about the product looking great and being intuitive and all those good things. It's how you explain to carers what's coming 2 weeks in advance of them being trained. It's how do you support carers, the tone of voice, all those things. All that comes into the mix. Because people usually are not too thoughtful on how technology is designed for social care, the technology ends up being pretty horrible. And people need to go through 2 days training courses to learn how to use it. It becomes almost, it becomes an impediment for them to do their jobs. And therefore, that's where the perception of technology, that's what shaped the perception of what technology is in health and social care for a long time. You still to this day, I mean, a GP, I suspect that when you go and have an appointment with your GP, in my mind, there's about 30% of their brain power that is being consumed by inputting the right coded entries onto System 1 or TPP so that they get the right brownie points in terms of reporting. Because those systems are that hard to operate. It's a GP is an expert in using System 1. They're not a medical practitioner. And therefore, that's the perception people have. Technology in social care is horrible. And then on the other side of the fence, you then have technologists who never bothered with actually stepping into the other territory, just saying that they're clueless, they're not good with computers. And I think this is perpetuated through, I mean, even through studies and curriculums and degree syllabus. A nurse in the 21st century nowadays will go through a nursing school, get their certification, and they will not have had one single topic where they're studying technology in healthcare. This is completely absurd, but it's taking a long time for this to change. And does that mean that nurses don't get technology? Right? We know that's silly. You had a question about pricing model, right? So our first attempt at defining a price was pretty pathetic because we just wanted to work out how can we not lose money. So we built it on I have lots of experience in the service industry, consultancy and so on, where everything is cost plus. Everything you price is based on how much it costs you plus a margin. Obviously in products that's completely silly. Never do that. So it's about understanding what's the value for a client and then pricing it from that. And essentially the pricing model for us was defined by understanding the revenue stream of our clients. So we didn't want to price our product based on the number of accounts or the number of carers that they have or the number, no, it's based on their revenue. So if they have 80 beds, by the way, a price of a bed in the UK for a care home is somewhere between 500 and about 3,500 per week per bed. What we do is simply looking at that revenue stream and saying, so our baseline price, and this is fairly public, is £3.50 plus VAT per bed per week. And that just stacks up. It held together pretty well. All our competitors have prices that become way too complex based on how many handhelds, how many carers do you have on shift and so on. You almost need a spreadsheet to work out the price. I think the benefit of understanding the business of your client when you're defining a price is essential. So you really need to understand how is this going to stack up in their mind when they're working out how much we're going to cost. When we compare ourselves to our nearest competitors, we're currently somewhere between 2 and 3 times more expensive. And it just holds together. Over the last 4 years, I spent a lot of time abroad in care homes, and that's it sounds really weird. It's not your usual choice for holidays. I've been to care homes and nursing homes in Japan, in Australia, Germany, Belgium, France, Spain, Portugal, and yes, it's completely different. It's just ridiculously different. Which means that for us to expand consistently, we probably need to be in a sector that is more, or in a vertical that is more consistent when you go across borders, hence hospitals, right? So if we start doing hospital care, because clinical pathways are defined by evidence-based practices, the practice of running cancer ward in a hospital in France is not too dissimilar from running the same ward in the UK. And therefore, it's a lot easier for us to, once we are in that specific segment, going across borders, and then working our way back into care homes. But care homes are extremely different from country to country. There's clearly a difference between the egg or the bacon in your English breakfast, because in that breakfast the chicken was involved and the pig was committed, right? And your investors are committed. Unless they have their money in, they're just involved. And you can have as many cups of coffee with a knowledgeable neighbor as you like, but if they don't have their money in, you're not going to get the same commitment and alignment of interest. And I got to say, getting those investors was important not just because of their business knowledge. There were a lot of criteria that I realize now I had in mind when I picked them. These are investors for whom the social impact side of our business is really important too. So this is not they're not seeing us purely as a financial play, which I think most angels don't do anyway. Yes, like ridiculously so. If we didn't have, and I'm not talking about this as if it was an unnecessary burden. It's just part of the, comes with the territory, really. I'd say, in terms of technical cost, it's probably 50% of your costs are accrued due to the fact that you are operating in healthcare. You have information governance toolkits to abide by. You have lots of stuff to do with the information commissioner's officer that you need to be very mindful of. So yes, it has a massive cost. It also has a cost in how you put your team together. So for us, onboarding a person is not as straightforward as onboarding a person into any other business, because we do criminal record background checks on absolutely everybody. We do references. We do a lot of training before people are allowed onto our systems. Because yes, people who work with us in certain roles have access to very, very sensitive data. So it just comes with the part and parcel of the journey, really.
Nuno, thank you very much for coming. I think Nuno will be around if anybody wants to have a quick chat. There may be some beer left. There's probably no pizza left. But thank you for coming, and thank you, Nuno.
Thank you. Thank you.